Let me introduce us. My guest this week is Gary Hamel, legend in his own time, author of many, many, many books. I think I'm glad to say a friend, somebody we run into at conferences and share ideas with. Just so those of you that don't know, we will be recording this, so do not say anything you do not want the New York Times to find out about, or that you don't want your mother holding up at the Thanksgiving table, or type anything. Missy will be keeping track of our conversation and sort of noting things. I'll keep an eye on the chat if I can, and answer any questions that come up that way. So welcome. It's such a pleasure to see you.
Well, it's nice to be here, Rita. Thank you for introducing me. And yes, we both have a real interest in strategy, and it's been quite an interesting journey, starting with strategy and ending up writing about people at work. But maybe we can talk about that.
Oh, okay, I am vindicated. Macmillan, if you're listening, the science of implementation is actually a fascinating topic. But I want to go back just to sort of put things in context. So I think you and I first met, I want to say right around the time you were promoting Competing for the Future in 1994. I just joined Columbia Business School, and you were this like superstar on the horizon. And then you and CK did this Strategic Management Society conference in Phoenix a couple of years later. And that was my first SMS, so I was just awed by all the famous people. And the two of you really made an effort to bring, I think that was the first time I ever met Dan Tapscott. We were talking about this thing called the internet, and you were going to have toasters that could talk and refrigerators that could communicate. We all thought it was science fiction. I mean, totally science fiction at the time. And here we are, with talking toasters and phones that can be supercomputers and all that stuff. And you really were there right at the beginning. So a couple of pieces that always struck me as just prescient. I think one of the most notable is bringing Silicon Valley inside. And I think that really set the stage for a lot of the work that's been done on corporate innovation and corporate, doing new things since then. So with that as background, let's talk about this journey from that idea of strategy to where you are now with, organizations, humanocracy. How do we get around these companies we've created so that people can actually contribute at work?
Well, let me say just a word or two about the journey, because it might be interesting to some people. I don't know. But, the thing for me, Rita, I did my PhD in international business. I showed up at the London Business School the first term. They said, by the way, you're teaching competitive strategy. And whatever that was, 1983. And let me say, I was very grateful for Michael Porter, who had written a great book, had cases to teach, and I could start to kind of piggyback on that. But I have to say, very early in that experience, literally in the first term, it occurred to me that the two, there are three really interesting questions about strategy. One is, why do some strategies make more money than others? Like, what's a good strategy? And clearly, Michael Porter had a very compelling answer on that. And we could look at extant strategies and say, like, well, why does this deliver a lot more? And five forces, all that. But it seemed to me the slightly more interesting question was, well, where do game-changing strategies come from? How do you find one of these things? We all know it when we see it, but where do they come from? And that led to a very long research project, talking to hundreds of business innovators around the world and trying to understand the perceptual habits that allow people to see opportunities that no one else has yet seen. And it turns out you can learn those habits. There's no magic. It's not that some people are wired differently. It's just a different set of mental routines that helps you see around and over what is to what could be. The second question that seemed equally interesting, remember this was, I'd done my PhD at University of Michigan. I'd seen the car industry go to the wall under the threat of global competition. And the other question that occurred to me is like, well, what do you do with a strategy when it's reached its sell-by date, right? How do you get rid of one of these things, or how do you change it in some fundamental way when the world has moved on? And at the time, when I was teaching that first class, I couldn't find very good answers to either one of those questions. Where do they come from? And how do you pivot as a large, substantial organization? So I devoted a lot of my time to that. And of course, what I learned is that if you really want to create a great strategy, it has to be a new strategy. That in the end, the only thing that really makes any difference about any strategy is how it's different from every other strategy. And so strategy is, in essence, a creative act. It is an act of innovation. And what was equally clear to me is if you spent your entire career climbing an organization, learning how to run the old model, and your skills are all based on that, you are inclined to defend what's already there. And you may not have the vantage point that allows you to see the new things. And so given that this is a creative act, given that if you look at Silicon Valley, you have hundreds, thousands of new strategies emerging every year, new business plans. It's not only a creative act, but it's something that happens, or your odds of finding a great strategy really is an arithmetic function of how many options you create in the first place. And what I could see at the time was the typical so-called strategic planning process, which is an oxymoron, like, I don't know, Scottish cuisine or a man bun or something. The typical strategy process was entirely linear. There was no strategy, and it was all planning, and you just never get there. So we did a lot of work around open strategy, bringing hundreds and thousands of new voices into the strategy conversation and so on. But then the second question of how do you...
This is part of your management lab, right? Or was that...
Well, way earlier than that, way earlier. I think the first, and again, whether you want to go here or not, I think the first real open strategy effort that I led was in the early 1990s when I got this very call from a little company in Finland I'd never heard of called Nokia. And they said, hey, we'd like to kill Motorola. And it was pretty clear, well, if you want to kill Motorola, you can't do what they did. And that means you have to be looking and learning in places they're not. You cannot build a highly differentiated strategy on undifferentiated insights. You have to know things and believe things that they simply haven't even thought about. So we divided hundreds of people at Nokia up into small teams. We had engineers off in Venice Beach in California, in clubs in Tokyo, trying to understand, how are kids thinking? But out of that came a very highly differentiated strategy that got summarized in I think the phrase is 1994, that the mobile phone would become the remote control for life. And that was about 13 years before the iPhone. But I learned the power of when you bring new people in the conversation, when you open this thing up, and you build strategy out of a foundation of truly new and unconventional insights. So that was one of my first experiences there. And we did that many, many times thereafter in different forms. But the second thing more recently that became more and more interesting is, why did big companies get stuck? Living where I live for now more than 30 years, the assumption in Silicon Valley is the incumbents will lose, right? That they and this has never been a problem of resources. The incumbents have plenty of cash, lots of customer relationships, really smart people. And of course, what we've been told, which I think is pretty much rubbish, but what we've been told is that large companies are somehow constitutionally unable to innovate. And I don't think that's true. What I would say is large bureaucratic companies are unable to innovate, but we need to make that distinction. But what I could see, at least for me, as I thought about it, the fundamental constraint of kind of shedding the past and making that pivot was that in a typical organization, we had concentrated the responsibility for setting strategy and direction at the top with a group of people who had a lot of their emotional equity invested in the past, who often felt the need to defend decisions that had been made 5 or 10 or even 15 years ago. And however smart they were, had nowhere near the amount of bandwidth and perspective to understand everything that's changing and therefore what might we be able to do. And so, it hit me that probably the most typical reasons companies miss the future is that senior leaders fail to write off their own depreciating intellectual capital. And they have a view of the world, of customers, of technology. So, think about what happened at Microsoft. And I'll tell you a quick little anecdote. And then you better get control of this conversation because I could just wander.
Oh, yeah, we're good.
I remember speaking, I think it was either 1999 or 2000. I'd been invited to speak at Bill Gates' CEO Summit. So I'm sitting in this conference room in Redmond, Washington, with the CEO of American Express, Sony, Fortune. American Express, Toyota. I don't know, all these, whatever.
I was there. I was part of the design team at that time. In fact, I was one of the biggest advocates for bringing you into that. Absolutely.
Okay, well then I have to thank you for this story, Rita. So I remember I gave a little talk on the post-PC world and what would happen when the PC was no longer, the personal computer was no longer at the center of the digital universe, but just another device. And probably the net was in the center. Well, at the end of this talk, a senior Microsoft person came up to me, obviously a little bit frustrated, and said to me, Gary, at Microsoft, we do not believe in the post-PC world. We believe in the PC plus world, as if everything will be an extrapolation of what we're already doing. And I wasn't quite sure what to say, but after I gathered my thoughts, what I did say was, the future is surprisingly indifferent to our preferences. And that may be what you hope, but may not turn out that way. And of course, it's very interesting. And I've kind of felt guilty through the years that I've told this story, but it's interesting that when Satya Nadella took over, one of the first things he said was, for far too long, we thought about Windows and the PC as the center of everything. And it wasn't. I mean, with all respect to Satya Nadella, who's, as far as I know, is a brilliant person, the fact that Microsoft's share price has rocketed since he took over is less about him, that he finally gave the organization permission to throw off the past. And we actually dug deeper into that. We looked at over 20 years of all the opportunities Microsoft missed. And what's interesting is most of those, they had teams inside the companies who were doing brilliant work. They were right at the bleeding edge. But when it came time to get real resources and scale up, they'd run into Steve Ballmer or somebody else who'd say, like, that's not us, that's not Windows, and so on. And so those two things together, Rita, really convinced me that if you want to build a daring and a resilient and a creative organization, you got to get rid of the hierarchy. You have to get rid of the rule-oriented, conformance-driven cultures that we have. And we have to turn on those latent capabilities in our people. And that until we did that, until essentially we dismantled bureaucracy, our organizations would never be fundamentally more capable than they are right now.
And I think that's such a powerful observation. So quick Microsoft note, and then I do want to move to talking about the book. So two initiatives at Microsoft that were totally, as you described. One was called the Leaf, I think, and it was a foldable iPad-like device, which was a reader there were people at Microsoft so passionate about this. They were literally sleeping in the office to work on this thing. And the other was a thing called the Kin phone, which actually did make it to market and then got killed off once it got out there. And that was, I thought, brilliant strategically. So the thought was less expensive than a smartphone, could feed the appetite for text and communication, but at a very budget sort of oriented place. So it's sort of a teen text device. And the Windows people hated it. The Windows Phone people, it was like, we're not doing that. We're just not doing that. And both of those things are really could have been monumental for the company. And now, as you said, Nadella's kind of released the year. So product placement, here we go. Humanocracy, which to me is really a synthesis of a lot of work you've been doing for a long time. And my husband will attest, I've literally had this book by my side all week. And you really talk about what I think is one of the more powerful phrases in a book that's full of powerful phrases is workplace alchemy. The idea that we're going to go from dead-end jobs to go-ahead jobs, and that this is within our power to do. And one of the metaphors I thought was so interesting that you use is we've got Instagram influencers. We have people creating original content on YouTube. We have people on Twitter who have massive followings, bigger than the followings of most companies. So when people have the tools to create and can get out there and do it, it's astonishing what they can do. And yet they come into work and it's like, you check your intelligence at the door and you turn into a box ticker. So maybe sort of share with us your philosophy about that principle. And then I want to dig into the principles because I think they're really, really interesting.
Yeah, so happy to do that, Rita. Let me just frame this for a moment in the conversation we're having right now around the world on where we are with capitalism, because a recent study, I think May of this year in the United States, found that only 29% of Americans would say that capitalism works for the average individual. A global study across 28 countries found that 56% of people said capitalism does more harm than good. And this is kind of a stunning statistic when you think about it, because really, what is the alternative here? And you look at what has happened politically over the last few years. You see the big vote for Brexit in the UK. You see the five-star movement in Italy. You see the Yellow Jackets in France. Here in the United States, we had a lot of workers who had lost their jobs to deindustrialization voting for Trump in the last election. This round, a lot of young people, college-educated young people who are marooned in gig economy jobs lining up behind Bernie and saying it's time to give socialism another chance. There's a deep, deep, deep level of disaffection. And I think work is a big part of that. You know, as human beings, every one of us seeks dignity, opportunity, and equity. And yet the data, and we'll come back to the data says that people do not get this on average at work. Only 15% of employees around the world are engaged in their work per Gallup. Only 1 in 5 believes their ideas matter at work. Only 1 in 10 says they're free to experiment with new methods, solutions, and products at work. The US Bureau of Labor Statistics says that 70% of all jobs require little or no originality. So if you don't find the dignity in your work, if you don't find the opportunity to grow, if you don't find the equity, you're not going to find enough of it in the rest of your life, I don't think, to make up that deficit. And then, of course, when you look at the economic data, over the last few decades, CEOs and the investor class have done quite well, but ordinary employees, not so much. And hence, I think, not so much a frustration with capitalism per se, with the idea that we want to reward risk takers and we need a system of getting money behind new opportunities, but more like, how are the rewards of capitalism actually distributed? And you know what, and that has produced all kinds of policy proposals. Now, beyond this, I'm happy to argue that we've let companies accumulate too much power, that we needed less industrialization, we need more incentives for long-term shareholding, all kinds of other things you can say yes are important. But I don't think anything is going to change until individuals in their millions feel like work works for them. So what does that mean practically? Well, if you look at the examples that we have in the book, what do you see are some themes again and again? This is true for Nucor in the United States, Svenska Handelsbanken in Sweden, Haier in China and around the world. So basically, these are companies that have divided their organizations into relatively small operating units, 15 to 50 people. Each operating unit has its own P&L. The people within those units have a lot of discretion. At Haier, every one of their 4,000 micro enterprises is guaranteed 3 freedoms: the freedom to set their own strategy, the freedom to define their own roles and how they're organized, and the freedom to distribute rewards. So they have freedom, number 2. Number 3, the organization is invested in them as business thinkers. They've upgraded their business skills. They know how to read the P&L. They know how to read customer feedback. So these are people who are thinking every day like business people. Number 4, they have a substantial upside. If they hit targets, they multiply their earning power. And so, you know, and it turns out that when you give people a real P&L, when you give them something that feels like theirs, when you teach them how to think like business people and so on, you do not need very many managers, if any at all. And so what happens when you do that is you turn employees into entrepreneurs. So you might call them micropreneurs, but into people who think like owners. And you know, that was certainly one of the insights in my work with Haier. You look at this Chinese company that probably has more capitalists per capita than any other company in the world. And I think for me, the way you solve at least some of the problems with capitalism is like the biggest problem is we just don't have enough capitalists. And we have this assumption that if you're an employee, you know, well, you're just an employee. There's no rule that says that has to be. I mean, we know from data that 77% of young Americans, and this is true around the world, would like to work for themselves, would like to start their business. Most of them won't get that chance. But that doesn't mean they can't work in organizations where they have that chance to be an entrepreneur. So one of the I think most destructive assumptions we make, and this is true for policymakers, economists, CEOs, is when we assume there's something called low-skilled job. Because I think that's BS, Rita. I don't think there's any such thing as a low-skilled job. There's no job that's inherently, you know, low-skilled. I think of those frontline workers at Nucor, the world's most profitable steel company, blue-collar employees working in self-managing teams, making investment commitments of tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars, having a big financial upside. I was asking the recently retired CEO of Nucor, I said, you guys are so innovative, you must have an amazing R&D group. He said, yeah, it's 20,000 employees strong. And when the people on the front lines see a new problem that they need to solve, if they can't do it, they hire the PhD metallurgist to figure out. There's not even a corporate R&D department. And so you see what happens when you turn on these capabilities. And yet we so often, and I think this is our credentialist privilege showing through. If you went to a good school, you have a degree, it's like, well, that's a low-skilled job. And then worse, we assume they're filled with low-capability people. But of course, this becomes a self-fulfilling kind of prophecy, because if you don't give those people opportunity to grow, to work on bigger problems, if you don't invest in their business thinking, and then they don't give much, you say, well, we told you so. And so we end up reinforcing this kind of
jobs. They're not, or they're working two jobs. They're not financially secure. I mean, you show me somebody who's worried about how they're going to get their children fed, who's going to be an effective employee. It's not going to happen.
Yeah, it's not going to happen. And, I asked, when I was talking to the folks at Nucor, I thought, well, all right, you guys may be located mostly in small rural areas, but you're hiring the best of the best. These aren't people with necessarily degrees, but they are really super. And it was interesting. The CEO again said, no. He said, I think we could hire 99% of the people in those communities. He said, everybody wants to do great work. Everybody wants to win. Everybody wants to learn if you give them the chance. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what their success demonstrates. But to do that, you have to tear down the organizational caste system. One of their more senior leaders at Nucor said, around here, being a manager is the least noble thing you can do. And we've turned that around. The mark of success in most organizations is getting a bigger title, getting a bigger job, indexing, up the hierarchy. And so you have all of this. And in fact, I would say, Rita, one of the most like sad statistics that came out of our research, there's a big a survey we did with HBR, was that 76% of respondents said the primary way you get ahead in our organization is through political behavior. You get better at negotiating targets, defending turf, managing up, deflecting blame, all these things there's this whole game in bureaucracy that's played for the stakes of positional power, which is only tangentially correlated at best with actually creating real value. And yet enormous amount of energy goes into that game. And
you have this great set of questions. And for those following along at home, it's page 259 of the book. And it's questions like, did I subtly undermine a rival? Did I hold on to power when I should have shared it? Did I pad a budget or exaggerate a business case? Did I fake enthusiasm? Did I disregard the human cost of a decision? Did I play it safe when I should have been bold? Did I fail to challenge a counterproductive policy? Did I do less than I could to foster the growth of those who work with me? And so on. So fascinating set of questions. And I felt like I saw my life flashing before my eyes when I went through those.
Well, it's the problem.
Every awful thing that's ever happened in a company.
My friend Bob Sutton at Stanford, he wrote this book called The No Asshole Rule. It's a great book. But the problem is bureaucracy makes assholes of us all. Mm-hmm. Right? We show up there, we find, okay, this isn't the game I wanted to play, but this is the game they play here. And, and that game only changes when some of us just say, like, no, I'm not going to play anymore, and you walk off the playing field, which is quite a gutsy thing to do. But I think what you're seeing in these organizations, these kind of post-bureaucratic organizations, they are redefining the game. And what you find there's still a lot of competition, but people compete to add value, which is not zero sum, rather than compete for promotion, which is zero sum.
Exactly. And I think, aside from the examples in your book, which are wonderful, you hear echoes of this everywhere, right? So if you talk about Jack Stack, right, the great game of business. And one of the phrases I remember him saying very vividly was, he said, look, the typical guy who works in a plant, he's the chairman of something called Springfield Remanufacturing.
I know his company and I know Jack, yeah.
I think you've written about it. But anyway, so just for our listeners, so this is like not a glamorous company, but he says, look, there's not a person who works on my plant who could not tell you 10 years worth of data about their favorite baseball player, what their batting averages were, what that meant, what the trend is, how the umpire ruled on this thing, how the coach is assembling his team, where he should be spending his money. If they can do that for a baseball team, they can do that for business. And so he unveiled a thing called radical transparency. Everybody has to learn. And it's written about in a wonderful book called The Great Game of Business. So that was one. Then Zeynep Ton, who I know you know very well, has written just a mountain of stuff on how good jobs are actually reinforcing when it's done right. That you can afford to have good jobs, and that will lead to higher performance if you do them in the right way. And and I think her work often gets misunderstood as, just pay people more. That's not it. It's a whole system.
No, in fact, in the organizations we profile, Rita, they all pay way over the odds, but they don't pay it because they're generous. They pay it because people are creating extraordinary value. And you can afford to do it. And if you don't, those people know they're creating value and they'll leave. So yeah, I do think you create this virtuous circle. And I think, I look at a company like Nucor, and I can tell you, if that were the norm, we'd not be having any debate in the West about deindustrialization. These companies can take on any companies in the world quite happily. Employees are embracing innovation because it allows them to do more with less, and they get paid for doing more with less. So, yeah, I think, I do have to say though, I think a lot of the conversation about like good jobs has really, the way we're thinking about it is pretty pale, right? We're thinking about, well, that means flex time. It means on-site childcare. It means, slightly more democratic ways of, it means an idea market where you can share your ideas and so on. All of which, by the way, are quite brilliant and quite important. Or now it means, working from home. But seldom does it mean we're going to give you a substantial financial upside. We're going to give you a big voice in decision making. We're going to invite you into the conversation about where we go next as a company, right? So, we're working to create better jobs, but still mostly inside of that old bureaucratic framework. And I can tell you, most jobs are not going to be truly good jobs until you have organizations that have no more than 1 or 2 layers. You cannot have good jobs when you have 4 layers of oversight or 5. You will be infantilized just by definition if you have that kind of oversight in an organization.
Yeah, so one of our colleagues, Erin Mayer at INSEAD, who does a lot of work on culture, just published this terrific book about the culture at Netflix. And what she talks about is we pay people at or above market. We give them incredible amounts of responsibility, but they also have incredible amounts of freedom. And I think they're trying very hard to operationalize some of these ideas. So let's talk about the principles, because I think this is really an interesting and interconnected set of ideas. And so you name 7 of them in the book and then go through examples of each one. So ownership, markets, meritocracy, sense of community, openness, experimentation, and paradox. And I want to hone in on paradox just for a minute, because one of the things Erin says that I think is really insightful is she said, at Netflix, what they do is they're very conscious of the paradox. So let's take the principle of, the average performers get a generous severance, right? And now for a lot of cultures, that would freak you out, right? You'd say, oh my God, these are people that are going to be competing with each other and we're all trying to make our way up the Forrest ranking. And she said, no, what they've decided is that is a high performance, high maintenance thing. And we are deliberately going to give up on security, feeling like we're all part of one big happy family, singing Kumbaya together. We're going to give up on that for this choice that we've made. And I think we are very bad at making those kinds of very conscious trade-offs when it comes to these sort of issues.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think bureaucracies abhor paradox. Like just tell me is it yin or yang? Like just make up your freaking mind here. And and it is a tough. I mean, the one you mentioned. How do you create an organization where you have intense internal competition, where the best ideas, the best people do rise and do more? At the same time, you have an incredibly strong sense of community, where people link arms, they're willing to take risks together, they support each other emotionally. I mean, one of the most disturbing Gallup findings is that only 2 out of 10 people have a friend at work. Holy cow. That can't be right, and we know it's not right, and we know the consequences. But it's not that, it's the trade-off between size and agility, between innovation and efficiency, between discipline and freedom, and so often, Rita, the way we try to manage these trade-offs is we set them at the top. We'll say, we got enormous margin pressure, so let's put in a headcount freeze. And so for the next 6 months, nobody can hire anywhere across the organization. And so those kinds of things are very simple, but they're also very crude. And my thinking has always been, I make the argument in the book, that those kinds of trade-offs need to be localized. So if I'm 4 or 5 levels down, I'm sitting, I'm ready to work. I have to decide every day. So I have a choice. Let's say I'm in marketing. Do I spend the day devising a better marketing campaign for existing product, or do I put my feet on my desk and think about a whole new category because we just haven't been growing? How do I get the information to make a smart choice there? Because what we know is when you aggregate choices, they become very crude. They're going to be wrong at least 49% of the time. And the analogy I use in the book is the analogy of being a parent. So if you're a parent, particularly if you had young kids and then teenagers, you are constantly managing the paradox, the tension between love and discipline. And so you'll put a toddler in the corner, you take the toys away, you said, this is a timeout. That's just like, that's no good. You can't behave that way. And then you give the kid a hug before you walk away, which, confuses the hell out of them. But like, that's what you do. But what we do in our organizations, we have a vice president of parenting. And so you send up the reports and they say, well, we noticed that last quarter, 10 tantrums were up by 30%. So we need timeouts by 30%. Like how is that possibly useful to you as a parent? And so, the fact is, as human beings, we are very good at managing trade-offs. If you give us the information, if you give us the context, we will make pretty good trade-offs. But when you divorce that from action, then they become very, very clumsy, and then you end up with organizations that just where the pendulum just swings back and forth, and you're constantly on the wrong foot. But I don't think it has to be that way. And I think we provide some pretty detailed book advice in the book on how to successfully localize these big trade-offs rather than hoping somebody at the top is going to see it right.
So a couple of our viewers have put in the chat the word, how do you start? How do you begin to tackle this? So, you've got a bunch of people saying, this isn't how I want to spend 8 or 10 or 12 hours every day at work. We want to do something differently. We've got 7 layers of management. We've got 12 layers of management, 15 layers of management. Where do we even begin?
So I think, let me answer that in 2 ways, or say 2 things. I think this journey, you have to be both revolutionary and evolutionary. You have to be able to imagine organizations that look almost nothing like the ones we work in now. When I met Jos de Blok, who founded Birdzorg, this big Dutch home.
I love Birdzorg.
He tells me, we got 16,000 people and we have 2 managers. All right, like how many of us go, like, yeah, you can work in this highly regulated industry in critical patient care with incredible professional standards, and you can do that with really almost no head office and 2 line managers. I mean, it's like, let me use an analogy. Most of us today have gotten familiar with the idea of radical business model innovation, of the sort I wrote about when I wrote Leading the Revolution many, many years ago. So, we understand that YouTube and Netflix are fundamentally different than terrestrial television of 20 years ago. We understand that Apple Pay and Alipay are fundamentally different from checkbooks. So we get that. The question is, can you imagine similarly radical changes in the management model? Because if you can't, you're stuck, and you will miss the future, because organizations out there are doing this kind of innovation right now. And by the way, if you believe that incumbents tend to be overly committed to their existing business model, wait till you see how committed they are to the management model, because that affects their pay, their power, and whatever. But you have to be able to think. You have to be able to think radically, and hopefully the book helps you do that. But then you also have to have an evolutionary pathway from here to there. No one's going to give you the permission to blow things up. You can't just tear down what's there. You certainly cannot wait for bureaucrats to uninstall bureaucracy. That would be a very long, long wait. So at least part of the answer, I think, Rita, is you have to take responsibility where you are to start hacking the old system. How did Linus Torvalds build the most successful software in the world? That is in basically every smartphone, runs every server on the web. He built it by putting out a little bit of code and asking other people to build on it, right? It was a collaborative project. And he said, and I'm sorry, I won't get his quote right, exactly right, but he said, a massively parallel project with rapid feedback will beat top-down design every day of the week. And I think that's true. One of the challenges in making this journey is when you look at these, at kind of the post-bureaucratic vanguard, you find a couple of things that give you pause. First, many of them were born that way, right? They started like Birdzorg. Birdzorg, their founding idea was humanity over bureaucracy, and then they went from there. So you had a clean sheet of paper. Or you have a company, let's say like Nucor or Svenska Handelsbanken, or even higher in China, that went through a performance crisis. You were lucky enough to have the concurrence of a performance crisis and a philosopher king, right? Philosopher queen, who came in and said, let's try something else. Most organizations are not greenfields, and most are not run by, one of these legendary CEOs. So what do you do? So that's where I think it comes back to to thinking about how do I start where I am? How do I hack? How do I develop that hacker ethos? And the fundamental hacker ethos is start where you are, solve what you can, right? Share it, hope, try to get it to propagate. So let me give an example, because most of us, we feel pretty helpless. If you look at the HR policy, finance, IT systems, whatever those things are in an organization, it's like, what do I do with that? Like, I don't even report to the people who can change this. I don't even know them. So like, what in the world do I do? So I think so let me give an example of a couple of hacks. We did a little project with, I won't bother with the company, but a small group of folks inside of an e-commerce unit in this company said, why don't we have something like internal Kickstarter? Now, when you have an idea, you got to go get into the budget process somehow, or you convince your boss who's worried about other things, and ideas should be able to compete on an equal footing for capital. That was the basic idea of bringing Silicon Valley inside all those years ago. So obviously, if you have that idea, okay, let's do Kickstarter. Do you go to your CFO, who says we don't have the funds, or I can't imagine, what the criteria would be like, and I think this would lead to a lot of irresponsible? Do you go to HR? Do you go to IT? You'll spend years trying to win that argument. Instead, they did a little experiment, Rita. This is 60 people. They went to their boss. They said, will you give each of us $150 for an experiment? That was an easy thing, $9,000, whatever it was. They put up just a whiteboard. They said, okay, if you have an idea that's not in the budget that you think has promise, put it up on the whiteboard. Here's a little form, slap it up there. They got 10 ideas quite quickly. Then they said to anyone, come up and put your funding commitment on a little sticky and I'm willing to put $50 behind that idea. So they ran this experiment for 30 days. Half of the ideas met their funding goals. Everybody thought it was fantastic. And just that simple experiment was enough for the organization to say, all right, yes, we should probably do this. And so, leaders are very used to saying no to people. And I have to say, not without reason, because 90% of ideas are stupid. And so, the safest thing is just say no. But they find it very hard to say no when a group of people has said, we're going to go build something, we're going to try it, and here's the data. Then it's much harder to say no. But I think that the trick of that is, if you want, and by the way, we spend several chapters in the book talking about how do you build your first hack. So we try to be extremely, and there's a whole online course that is free that will take you through this as well. And you find that at humanocracy.com. But the point is, resist the temptation to go up, right? Don't ask anybody's permission. Go sideways. See if you can find a few people who are willing to help you work on this, willing to help you run an experiment. Because if you try to go up, you're going to be banging your head, I think, into the wall. And so, everybody has choices. You can bitch about this, or you can hack it, but it is a choice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I love that not going up, and because I think it's important to remember that the model that's in place was put in place for the past. And you started by talking about this, and I talk a lot about temporary competitive advantage, that, when it's gone, you need to completely rethink. And often the thing that's going to come after is quite different than what came before. And very important to remember. So one of the things that I've been really interested in is this whole notion of who gets to be in a formal leadership position. And I'm sure you're familiar with the work of Thomas Chamorro for Music, where he talks about, we confuse confidence with competence, and we do it over and over again. And what I love about your idea of creating these hacks wherever you are is now you've got a way of defining competence, which doesn't depend on somebody looking at you going, oh, they seem like a leader,
I think that's so important, Rita. We have a chapter in the book on meritocracy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And even, by the way, even that is quite a difficult topic today, because obviously there are millions of people who never get the chance in life to develop their skills. And that's an enormous challenge. It just doesn't happen to be the one we're tackling in the book, at least not outside the sphere of work. But having said that, as you said, and we quote an immense amount of research, but the bottom line of the research, and this is documented, for sure, that there's essentially no correlation between where you sit in the formal hierarchy and your actual competence, literally. And in fact, one study by the CEB found literally zero correlation between actual performance and performance reviews. So you have all this theater and all this whatever, and worse, there's all kinds of toxicity built into this. if you think you negotiate your KPIs with your boss, then and you feel all I have to do is meet those targets and I'm good. Well, you're going to spend way too much time worrying about what your boss wants. You're going to spend way too much time sucking up. So I think we have to pull down that whole edifice. But I think in a way, and so what we need to move to is something where influence and compensation are correlated entirely with peer-attested competence, not with positional authority. Mm-hmm. Not with positional authority.
And it's hard. I mean,
I don't know if I tell this anecdote.
And Thomas talks about this. He says, our lizard brains, like, we're like deeply programmed, like, oh my God, saber-toothed tiger, whoever in the group says, let's go that way. We do that, right? And that's just not the way we
I mean, obviously we lay out all of the things that corrupt our judgments around competence. And one of them is bluster and whatever. It's, and we mistake, that confidence for competence. I will say another thing that we do is we tend to vastly overweight the value of administrative competence. Mm-hmm. So, you talked about leadership. Let's riff on that for a moment. I think, sadly, over the last couple of decades, we have hopelessly conflated the idea of leadership with the idea of positional power. Mm-hmm. So you look at the average company's leadership development program, it is completely stratified. It's, we're going to teach you to lead yourself, lead your team, lead a business unit, lead the org. I mean, it has nothing to do with real leadership. If by leadership you mean people who make a catalytic contribution to collective accomplishment under difficult circumstances, that's not what we're teaching people how to do. We're teaching people how to get ready for that next level. And the language has become so corrupt. In fact, we did this recently, Rita. We looked at we did some Ngram. We were looking at Google mentions. So round about, if you go back to the 1970s, there's a lot of talk about management development and nothing about leadership development. And then over the next couple of decades, management development disappears and leadership development takes off. Let us not pretend that back in the 80s, we suddenly learned how to build leaders. We did not. As Jeff Pfeffer and Barbara Kellerman will tell you, we know nothing about how to grow leaders. But what we did was we said, well, management, once Peter Drucker wrote The Effective Executive, okay, we've codified it, not much more to know there, let's move on. So we had to have something new to sell in business schools, consulting companies, and we said, well, let's tell people we can make them leaders, right? And we'll teach everyone how to have the innovation instincts of Steve Jobs and the political intelligence of Lee Kuan Yew and whatever. But we can't. We don't know how to do that. And yet, we call people leaders when really leadership still means you just have a bigger head count and you have a bigger budget. And I think one of the things to recognize is that, bureaucracy is a technology of its time. Mm-hmm. And if you go back to the mid-19th century, when we began mashing up military command structures with industrial engineering, at that time, most employees were illiterate, not some, most. And so you needed this new category of super employee to tell them what to do. And we called them managers. And that's why business schools got built, was to turn this. And 100 years ago, that was a rare skill. It was like being a geneticist or a data scientist today. Now, I can tell you, there's very little value in administrative work per se, at least the way it's done in most organizations. And yet, that pyramid is basically an administrative aristocracy and so that I think we have to go back and change. I think, and there's some organizations, we tell some stories at Gore, at some others, Bridgewater. There's some organizations now that are decoupling any sense of formal hierarchy from peer attested competence and saying, what we want. I mean, we need multiple hierarchies. And where you sit in that hierarchy will depend on the issue under consideration and how much wisdom you can bring. And so I have no problem with the idea of hierarchy per se, because on any given problem, some people are smarter. They know more. I know some things, I don't know other things. So I'm quite happy to have different hierarchies. If it's a hierarchy of medical knowledge, I'm nowhere, right? So I think we can move in that direction, but I think we have to be very careful about how we use this word leader. I hear, maybe you've heard this, I hear people talk about the leadership team. And I go, who the hell is that? Who's the leadership team? What do you mean? you mean the people who sit on the executive committee? I said, guess what? Most of them are not leaders. If by leader you mean people would willingly choose to follow you, and I can tell you they're not a team. If by team you mean selfless people pulling in the same direction, right? But we use this language, and so we need to get honest about that.
I totally agree. So talk a little bit about the DOT system at
Bridgewater.
Yeah, Bridgewater.
Well,
which I think that would freak a lot of people out.
By the way, I'm told, I may be wrong on this, I'm told they're partnering with Zoom, and this is going to be a feature on Zoom, that you'll be able to rank anybody and everybody that you talk to real time. Let's see if that happens. But I heard somebody told me they're working on this.
Whoa.
Like, to be confirmed. To be confirmed. But essentially it's this. It's a simple little app. I think they have 8 or 9 categories of contribution. If you're sitting in a meeting with someone, you're encouraged to rank them. You know, Rita says something really insightful that, like, wow, I didn't think about that. So I go in like strategic perspectives, and there's a category that says, you know, has new insights. I give Rita like, 10 out of 10. And so within these categories, they have subcategories. But as I understand it, over the period of a year, the average employee will get several thousand of these dots. Everyone's dots are visible online. You can go look at anybody's skill profile against all these categories, who rated them, and so on. You can look at the CEO. Everybody's encouraged to rate the CEO, Ray Dalio. And so what Ray will tell you is that today, for any decision, what they're asking is, who is believable? They talk about the believability index. How believable? So your share of voice in any conversation should depend on, what do you know? Do people trust you? Do they think you have expertise here? Rather than, well, in the end, Rita's an EVP, so like whatever Rita says. And, I mean, you see this all the time, Rita. You've seen this. You're sitting in some meeting, you got the EVP at the end of the table. All of their subordinates are sitting around the table nodding, buying career insurance. Yes, of course, wonderful idea, right? But like that, you just get bad decisions that way. And so what they are trying to do is they are trying to decouple decision rights and decision authority from formal hierarchy, which they must be decoupled because, as we said a few minutes ago, we know they don't correlate. So why are they coupled together?
Well, right. I think that's fascinating. Now let me just do a check. Are you okay for like 5 minutes after the hour?
I'm okay for whatever you want. I was late, Rita. I was struggling with computer problems. I'm deeply sorry for that.
Oh, that's fine. I mean, everybody's got to be we've got to have a little flex in our lives these days. So there's a wonderful anecdote that you talk about how even in great companies, even in organizations that have kind of cracked a lot of this, you still have to be vigilant. And you tell a story about Herb Kelleher at Southwest, so very famous, from the ground up innovator, who started out as the corporate legal counsel. I mean, he wasn't the founder of the company. He joined them like as a legal guy, which I always thought was interesting. And so apparently there was a young person who said, well, in my department, and Kelleher's like, oh my God, do you no longer work for Southwest Airlines? Oh, I didn't know that. We better tell the SEC. I mean, humorous, but kind of hang on here. Let's keep our eye on where this thing fits in the group of priorities. And it fascinates me that human beings are very tribal, right? We all have our little tribes that we're very comfortable with. But we can also rise above that in the service of a greater good. And these really excellent companies you're talking about seem to have figured out how to combine the best of both. So yes, we're a tribe, but we're the tribe of all of Southwest.
I think that's right. I would call it a community of communities, and or tribe of tribes, as you like. But yes, and as you say there, I think they are enormously attentive to those inbuilt tensions, and they recognize that in fact. I think of the analogy, let's say, of mercy and justice. So we all want to live in a society where both of those things are present, and not present just generally, but present in exactly the right combination to fit the circumstances. So, if I'm driving my wife to the hospital and she's in the last stages of labor and I get pulled over by the cop, I want, just like, turn your lights on and help us get to the hospital, right? You want all mercy, no justice. If somebody has been convicted of abusing a child, they may have a tragic story themselves, but we're going to err on the side of justice, right? No, we're going to protect our children. And so I think, Charles Simeon, who was a famous theologian at Cambridge writing at the end of the 19th century, he was talking about mercy and justice. And he said, the truth is not in one extreme and the truth is not in the middle. The truth is in both extremes. And all of these tough trade-offs, that's the reality of it. They are in both extremes. And so you have to be ever conscious of, like, is one side of this dominating or are we getting unbalanced? Are we straying too side? And again, I think the best way to do that is to localize the trade-offs and help people be smart enough to know that both of these things matter. One of the reasons I think Svenska Handelsbanken, amazing bank across north of Europe, has outperformed all of its European peers for 49 years in a row, is it's frontline people. It's people in their branches that are making the loan decisions. That no longer have, most banks, they go up, there's some algorithm. I mean, they have all the algorithms, but they're still finally made by, and more importantly, that loan stays on that branch's balance sheet until it's mature. So what happened through the financial crisis? There was a group of people that were incentivized to create new products and sell them that had no accountability for risk. In fact, you wanted to deceive the risk function in your bank. And you were only responsible for one side of that trade-off. There's a whole nother group called risk management, which is on the back foot and trying to somehow hold the reins of the runaway horse. Couldn't be done, right? Why has Svenska grown faster, been more profitable, and had no financial crisis? Because they co-located those competing trade-offs. Of course we want you to grow, but guess what? Every single employee is also a risk manager. So I think, yeah, that seems to me the way you have to manage those, but you still have to stay very, very alert.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, and the Black Swan folks will tell you, don't ever take advice from someone on a difficult decision if they have absolutely no stake in what's going to happen, right?
Yeah, well, exactly.
They're not
a one-sided stake.
Yeah, totally.
But I think, Rita, for me, the most challenging piece of all of this, I mean, one of the questions, and I didn't really talk about this, I guess, maybe a little bit in the book, but the question that has really troubled me is, I have a little bit of gray hair. You apparently have none, but I have gray hair.
I will accept your shameless flattery for what it's worth.
I have gray hair. And I can remember some of these extraordinary management innovators, like Chris Ardress, and some of them are still with us, some of them not, but Chris Ardress and Peter Singhi and Ed Schein and all these people. And you go back and you look at the work they did inside of organizations, experimenting, doing these amazing things, huge performance gains, huge engagement gains. And then you're looking like, why didn't those things stick? Why did they stick? And the people who've looked at this deeply, and we've done our little look, is there's really only one conclusion, that at the end of the day, the empire struck back. That you really can't change management in any important way without redistributing power. And as many of us have found, the people who have power are not always eager to give it up. In fact, mostly not. Mm-hmm. And so I have enormous sympathy for CEOs who they're progressive, they understand, I think you probably find the same today. The average CEO knows their real problem is not the operating model. They know it is not the business model, even though that needs to change. They know their real problem is the organizational model. We have too many layers, we're too slow, we're too conservative, there's not enough entrepreneurship. They know that, and yet they feel very powerless to change it. Mm-hmm. Because they are, you think about, I have a dozen direct reports, another dozen direct reports. These are people who spent their whole careers learning how to accumulate and use positional power. What am I going to do? Go one at a time and say, you need to change your role. There's a new game. You were playing basketball. We now need you to play volleyball. Like, how is that going to work? I tell the little anecdote in the book about Pope Francis. And, he came, when he assumed the papacy, he committed himself to dismantling the bureaucracy of the Vatican. In fact, he said he called the bureaucracy the leprosy of the church. I don't think I've used any language quite that harsh, right? The leprosy. But somebody asked him, I think last year, how are you going? And he said, I feel like I'm cleaning the Sphinx with a toothbrush. To which my answer is, you better get some more toothbrushes. Right? But doing it by yourself, top down, is just like never, ever going to work. And of course, the advantage we have today, we've done this in some organizations. We actually built our own platform because we couldn't find one we really liked. But today you can bring together tens of thousands of people around this question. We'll put a MOOC up, and each week we'll introduce them to one of these principles. Here's how experimentation works at Amazon. Here's how meritocracy works at Bridgewater. Here's what openness looks like at Hire. And then you ask people, thousands of people, all right, if we took this principle seriously, what would you change in how we lead, hire, manage, organize? So we did this in one fairly small company, I think 3,000 or so people, 7,000 management hacks, 10,000 peer reviews. 100 of those went forward and had actual experimental designs built around them, because it's not just about having an individual hack. That's a good starting point, but I really believe when go back to Linus Torvalds, massively parallel with a fast feedback loop. So that top-down approach to change maybe works if you're doing something that's been done before and you literally can script it from the top. Another ERP installation, all right, let's just do the damn thing. But if you're trying to do something that is novel, that really hasn't been done before, and you have to do it in a way that works for you, then I think that has to be a crowd-solving exercise. Mm-hmm. And what you find, at least what we found when you do that, is that when you light up, the entire organization, the reactionaries, the people are more eager in protecting their prerogatives. There's no place for them to hide. Mm. Because actually, in a way, it's actually quite simple. The challenge is, how do I build a constituency for the future that's more powerful than the constituency for the past? Mm. And you cannot do that unless you find a way of working around the old power structure. And you can light up the people who have most of their emotional equity invested in the future rather than the past. And I think, one of my, I won't live to see it, Rita, I'm sure, but one of the things that would make me feel good is if one day we never again heard the word cascade when people talk about change. Because I think that's just bullshit, right? I think every truly useful change program will be socially constructed. Mm. Right? That's the principles of user thinking. Right? Design thinking. You start with the user, right? How simple is that? And then you work backwards. And, we tell some great stories about people who are doing this in our online course. They're the head of IBM HR, Diane Gerson. Now she's retired, but she had this wonderful story of engaging the whole organization and hacking their performance management system. How else would you do it? And yet that's still not the way change works in most organizations, right? So, but I think that's why at the end I'm super optimistic. I'm optimistic, one, because I think more and more people recognize that we're reaching the performance limits of the old model. We just can't pretend that that's not true anymore. The second reason I'm optimistic is you have this generation of people coming to work, first generation in 5,000 or 6,000 years at least, whose primary social reference point is not a pyramid, right? It's the web. And on the web, you only have followers if people want to follow you. On the web, every idea gets a chance to be heard, right? On the web, what people look at is your contribution, not your credentials, right? So that's the ethos they bring. Super, super good. And then the last reason I'm very optimistic is we now have a new set of tools. Right now, you can go to 5, 10, 70,000 people and engage in this, and you can crowd solve these problems. And so, our organizations historically were mostly vertical. Now they're mostly horizontal. And yet most leaders have really not yet. I mean, if you look at how we're using technology mostly today, Slack and chat and whatever, mostly it's to improve the efficiency of white collar teams. Mm-hmm. Right? It's groupware. It's to teams what Microsoft Office was to individuals 30 years ago. But very few companies have yet had the guts to say, okay, we're going to open up our strategy process to the entire company. We're going to ask the whole company to hack our management model. But I think that's like the only way. Like if you're not harnessing the genius of every single employee, you will lose to somebody who is.
Who is, absolutely. Well, so one really inspiring example, and a CEO who's going to be with me later in the month, is Klockner in Germany, and I'm sure you've heard of them. And one of the things they did was they installed non-hierarchical communication. And I mean, you can imagine, this is like a decades, centuries old German company with all the hierarchy and jawohl and, yes. And so people were like, you mean I could send a message on this thing and the CEO might read it? And they did, and he did. It was like, whoa, people are paying attention. So, even in an incredibly traditional organization, you can start to create this. So I'll throw in one of my optimistic ideas, which is when people, and I think about our MBA graduates or younger people, when they think about who their network is, or when they think about who they're loyal to, it's not inside the walls of an organization, right? The way it might have been at one point. It's now the network of people I know and trust. And one of my favorite examples is a young consultant that graduated, was given a project that those that know better thought would take her at least 3 to 6 months. Right? She comes back 3 weeks, she's got it done. And they're flummoxed. They're like, how did you do this? And she said, oh, well, I have this friend from business school who's just a brilliant designer, and he helped me with the user interface. And then I had this other friend that's great at designing surveys, and they helped me do the A/B test. And then she had assembled this virtual network. And what was astonishing was they worked for competing consulting firms. So this wasn't within their thing. So I think we're really rethinking what our professional networks are, what the resources are that we draw on, and these new technologies.
Say, even what the boundaries of the firm is.
Yeah, I think
where does that begin and end? And who's an outsider and who's an insider and so on. And I think that's completely old thinking. But I do think it's going to take an act of will. I've been, back to my earlier point, when you look at all these things over 40 or 50 years, and you look at T groups, you look at high performance work teams, you look at job enrichment, at total quality management, Six Sigma, Kaizen, continuous improvement, all the way up to
give me a brain freeze.
all the way up to agile, right? I can tell you, Rita, agile is going to make no damn difference. We've been inside the organizations that have been doing agile for 5 years. In almost every case, it's been recolonized by bureaucracy, right? It was because, let me throw a last idea out, but it's very important, I think. Give me just a minute to say this in this way. So, any field of knowledge over time develops a lot of internal coherence, right? There's a belief structure that all hangs together. So if you think about what we know about our organizations, at the top, you have a paradigm, and mostly we don't talk about those things. Those are taken for granted beliefs about, what's the best form of economic organization? What's the relationship of human beings to their organizations? What are the natural limits of human cognition? But we have a set of assumptions there, the paradigm. That paradigm points you to particular problems. So if you're John Locke and you believe in the sovereignty of the individual, you start to say, well, why not self-government, right? It takes you to a problem of how do we create a self-governing society? That in turn then takes you to a set of principles. Well, what principles do we need to do that? Well, representative government, universal suffrage, independent judiciary, freedom of assembly. And so you get a set of principles that you then work into processes, right? How does the electoral process work? How does judicial review work? So there are processes which then drive everyday behaviors and finally drive performance. So there's this whole stack. So here's what I think we've been doing for the last 40 or 50 years, including most people who write about, most management academics as well. We're putting most of our energy around processes and practices. So we go in and look at how decision-making works, or, we look at behavioral economy, how are they thinking about this? So we spend a lot of time looking at processes and practices, but ultimately you cannot do something fundamentally new until you go back to paradigms and problems and principles. You have to go back there. Sometimes my academic colleagues ask me, Gary, why does nobody pay any attention to our research? I say, well, you haven't reframed the problem. Right? You haven't reframed the paradigm, and you're not giving anything practical to do Monday morning. So it's neither provocative nor practical. Why would anybody pay attention? But what you see is, again and again, we've taken these new approaches like Agile, we graft them onto the old bureaucratic rootstock, onto the old mindsets, and then we wonder why it doesn't work, why it doesn't take. And the analogy I've had is it's like putting a tutu on a dog. Right? It doesn't make it a ballerina. It makes it a stupid looking dog, right? And so, and then we wonder, hey, we put a tutu on you. Why are you still, whatever dogs do. Let's not go there. But why aren't you a little more civilized at least? You have a tutu. And so I think, you reach a point in any field of human endeavor where you cannot do the truly new things unless you go back to first principles. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where we are now. And for me, the deepest principle of all here, Rita, is how we look at human beings at work. And so in that old bureaucratic model, the assumption was the institution hires the individual to make products and services. So in that rendering, the individual is an instrument. And I think we all know in our personal lives, if somebody treats you like an instrument, that's not a good relationship, right? Like if you're the person who washes the car, picks up the kids after school and does X, like, no, that's, that's all you are. That's not a good relationship. And so what I think we need to flip this around. We need to say, no, human beings are agents. They're ends, not means. They join an institution because it's a way for them to have an impact in the world they couldn't do on their own and make a living. But that little simple flip is everything. It sounds so insignificant. And you talked about Herb Kelleher. How many CEOs will again and again and again talk about love? Really, as a question, Ria, you talk to many, many CEOs, many leaders. How many of them have you ever heard say, fundamental thing that needs to drive our organization is love? Zero, I'm willing to bet. Zero, maybe one, right? It's like insane. Or you hear people talk about human resources. Like, what the hell does that mean? I have to tell you, I did a webinar last week for a very respected organization that should know better. They did the title of the webinar. The webinar was called Innovation from the Bottom. And I said, like, what the hell is the bottom? I sit on my bottom. I know what a bottom is. But what do you mean, innovation from the bottom? Like, are there talents that we have that we don't? Like, I don't think so, right? That's up here. And you go, but like, or I hear the managing partner of one of the most respected consulting companies in the world say this. This is like almost a verbatim quote. He said, the CEO, the CFO, and the CHRO will look into the future and plot, we'll look out and plot the future while everyone else has their heads buried in operations. What absolute crap. Like this idea that there's a few people at the top that like are so brilliant and can anticipate and see what's coming and everybody else is just grinding it out. Like that actually is the reverse of what is true. The people who are least likely to see the future coming is the people at the top. Doesn't mean they can't, but as a statistical probability, that is the least likely, And so this thinking has so permeated our curriculum, the consulting companies, our language, that it's going to take, I think, despite my optimism, it's going to take a lot of work to wring this out of our thinking and to break those old habits of thought.
Yeah. Inspiring. Absolutely inspiring. So the book, Humanocracy, Creating Organizations as Amazing as the People Inside Them. Hey, what a privilege to be able to connect with you. Thank you all for joining the Welcome to the Fight. Right?
May I just say, please, if you're listening, please follow me on Twitter. It's at Prof. Hamel, that's where I try to put new ideas. Welcome to have you follow me on LinkedIn. I post a lot of stuff there. And then if you want to know more about the work, that's humanocracy.com.
Humanocracy. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, everyone.